I am the other Miss Marcus in Gavin's address book. Unfortunately, I'm not Gaia Marcus, and I will not be talking about the National Data Strategy, but local data, local public services using data. So I'm going to introduce the Open Data Institute briefly, just in case certain members of the audience haven't come across before us, and then I wanted to talk through a specific project that we've been doing for about the last 2.5 years, looking at local public services and data. So this is the ODI's mission and vision. So, you know, I think everybody can agree that we want a world where data works for everyone. And the way that we look to do that is by working with both companies and governments to build an open and trustworthy data ecosystem. We are sometimes known as the Open, Data Institute, as opposed to just thinking about open data. We think about the entire data spectrum. So open data being, of course, data that anybody can access, use, and share. Some data we recognize very much needs to be closed, but then you have this really interesting, vibrant space in the middle as well around shared data. And overall, we default often to closed infrastructures, whereas we advocate for thinking about how we can make things more open as possible. This is a diagram which sums up our theory of change. Just to briefly talk you through it, we think that the most effective use of data, if you use data to make better decisions, that's what creates both positive social and economic impact. And there are 3 layers of value in there. So there are data stewards. If data is being stewarded well, then that enables individuals and organizations to create applications, services, infrastructures that enable better decisions and therefore enable that positive impact. But we see 2 potential negative scenarios, one being data hoarding, whereby data is understood to have fundamental value in and of itself and is treated like a commodity, and therefore is restricted. The other being data fearing, where individuals and organizations are concerned about the use of their data and therefore, again, restrict it. So in order to counter those two scenarios, we advocate for building openness, but also trust, and that's where this idea of an open and trustworthy data ecosystem comes in. And these various sub-levers, I guess you call them, there's arrows down here, are the ways that we think we need to do that. So that's by advocating for ethics, for equity, for engagement with a range of different communities, but also by demonstrating innovation, by building capability, and by building data infrastructure. And then the list of relatively optional things on the right, or on the left, depending on which direction you're looking at the screen, is what we actually do. So strategic advice, research, training. And the work that I'm about to talk to you about essentially was looking at this question. So why aren't there more open data public service case studies? We often talk about TfL. We often talk about CityMapper and other applications that have been developed there. There was a very interesting Deloitte review that put the number of £130 million worth of value on that in terms of cost savings and things like that. But we haven't necessarily seen the conversation develop further. So the fundamental question there was why? What are the barriers? And how can we understand that a little bit more? So I'll talk you through exactly what we did in slightly more detail, but the summary of it is that we can see that if you use data for public services, there are a range of different benefits and mechanisms that you can employ. So when we do see data, open and shared data being used for public services, we can see that it can enable better access to those services, more efficient services, and more informed policy development, that direct relationship with making better decisions. And often we see these benefits being employed in combination. So you start by making better decisions, and that means that you can have more efficient service delivery chains. But what sits underneath all of this fundamentally is that there can be cost savings for the local authorities themselves, but also more empowered citizens and better services. And that is really important. It's very easy when I go around talking about this work to get sidetracked by the details, but fundamentally that's why this is a useful thing to be thinking about. So we started by funding some local councils. We did it in 2 rounds. The first round was just really open and saying we would like to fund 4 local authorities to do open data service delivery design projects. And they were doing it in partnership with service design agencies as well. And then we did a second round of funded projects which were specifically looking at geospatial data, because there is an enormous amount of opportunity by better utilization of geospatial data. And then we wrapped all those learnings into this report here, which is where we've got that lovely grid there. This report also was looking at national examples of public services, both central government and third sector. So we have quite a broad range of insights there as to the use of open and shared data across the public sector, and also some of the barriers. But I wanted to talk to you about a couple of the examples of what we saw in these projects. So in North Lanarkshire, we did this project which was about FOI requests for business rate data. It was a really small project, but essentially the outcome of it was that those responsible for the service changed their understanding of what the actual service was. Instead of providing FOI request responses, they published the business rate data and started to see the service itself as the provision of the core data. And that saved them a significant amount of money. Obviously, we don't want to get rid of all of the FOI request infrastructure. We don't want to over-digitize all of our services, because digital inclusion is an issue that we need to maintain in our minds. But it was a very successful project which ended up winning an award. And fundamentally, it empowered citizens to have the information that they needed when they needed it. A very different project was in Falkirk, just up the road. And this was working with services that the council was doing in order to mitigate the harmful impacts of poverty. And this was part of our geospatial work. And essentially, it was documenting and mapping where the services that could be relevant to a vulnerable person who could be in need of things like food banks, where they were, how to get to them, what their opening times were, relatively basic things, but mapping them geospatially so that users could find them more easily and use them. And again, that comes back down to more empowered citizens, better access to services, and also more informed policy making, because you can understand what services are being used through a different data lens. In Kent, again, another geospatial project, they used, I'm running out of time. They used the data to improve their predictions there quite a lot. And then in Oxfordshire, they also were using communities to map their cycle infrastructure. So overall, the barriers that we saw that we have been trying to mitigate are these ones here. So we see these barriers over and over again in local authorities, and they're not actually data problems, they're cultural problems, they're human problems. And so we created a toolkit. There we go. And if you'd like to know more about the toolkit, then let me know afterwards. But I have massively overshot my time, so I'm really sorry about that. There you go.
I'm sure if anybody wanted to ask about the toolkit or barriers within local government. So who'd like to ask the first round of questions? Lots to dig into there. We've got Miranda down here, Sweelang there, and we've got the back row as well.
On the TfL and CityMapper question, do you think it's right that CityMapper should take TfL's open data and then charge TfL for the use of it afterwards?
Thank you. And then we've got Sweelang again.
Sweelang Harris from the Legal Education Foundation again. Really interested in particular in the project focused on addressing poverty through access to data and open data, and was just curious whether that project had an evidence base for the services that help to mitigate, address, avoid poverty. One of the particular interests for my foundation would be access to legal services, and whether there was useful data on the different kinds of sources of free legal advice.
Thank you.
Jack Tyndale, not from the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Data Analytics, which of course does not exist at the moment. I'd be interested to know, what do you think is the best way of sort of developing or avoiding the skills gap that one tends to get, particularly at local government, in sort of addressing very highfalutin concerns and matters pertaining to data with the local government level, and what can be done to address that?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, other Miranda, for that thorny question. And it is a thorny question. One of the really interesting things about the TfL case study is that it has created a data ecosystem around it. There are multiple new businesses and services that are developing around it and enabling citizens to access that service better, which is, I reckon, net positive. However, there isn't a business model apart from this for Citymapper, really. So that creates an interesting tension. I'm talking around this because essentially I don't have a clear answer for you. I don't know. It's a difficult topic, but I think it's one that we can carry on engaging with, and we need to do it in a way with more case studies and examples. This is the thing. In a deficit of only talking about TfL at all times, like TfL is a very, very specific public service. There kind of aren't really that many more in the country like them. So can we continue that conversation later? Thank you very much. In terms of poverty in the evidence base, again, I'm so sorry, but I don't know. But I can put you in touch with the people up in Falkirk who are running that strategy, and they are doing some absolutely fantastic work, so I really recommend you get in touch with them. And then in terms of avoiding the skills gap in local government, so MHCLG are doing some interesting work there, and working with the Cabinet Office as well. In terms of what skills people need, it really is from a ground-up perspective. We don't need everybody to be able to whip up machine learning models and things like that, but it's really about starting from the perspective of saying, what questions can I ask of data? What data do we even have? That is, dare I say it, one of the biggest barriers. Clarity about what data is there and who is accountable for it fundamentally preclude people from being able to engage with the opportunities that data can provide. So there's a skills thing in terms of enabling people to have that understanding, language, and experience, but also there's just a clarity around infrastructure and availability of data.
Next round of questions. We've got one right down here at the front, one in the middle, and then we've got, let's take the three in the back row as well, why not?
Do you think that, I think a lot of people use data all the time for their own work, but they use it on the basis of, I feel like it's good enough to give me a good steer. But when you have that tension of sharing it with someone else, for someone else to look at it, there's a barrier there because you have to be 100% bang on to be confident about sharing that data externally. And we're always told, no one knows that very few people have perfect data, but we have it's good enough, use it because it's better than nothing. How do you kind of take that, make that shift from being good enough to being confident enough to share, and kind of is there a sort of a way you could get more data out there being shared by being less, it has to be so perfect? I don't know, it's just interesting.
Thank you. Then we've got the middle row there.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about unknown unknowns. So where there's a huge benefit in opening up more data, making it more available, but as you pointed out, it's there are some data sets that really can't be made open. Is there a risk that, because open data is that much more easy to work with, that you're gonna encourage solutions to what is available, and then there's going to be kind of less investment in the more challenging, more difficult to solve problems that cannot be solved with open data?
Thank you. And we've got three very quick questions in the back row as well.
So it was partly sort of a more reflection on the 7,900% increase in accuracy. That's definitely that is the number. But it's, I think the question that comes from that connects to the thing you made about skills, but really sort of that piece around how bad was the model that had been used before, or the approach that had been used before.
Thank you. You spoke a little about just then about people being aware that the data sets exist. I was wondering what you thought about to what extent people understand the value of those data sets, And if the value isn't fully understood or appreciated yet, what could be done to improve that awareness?
Thanks. Hi. I was just wondering, when you're looking at access to services, have you done any linking to journey time data or any journey time modelling, particularly if you're looking at kind of people in poverty and their kind of dependence on public transport, and whether there's any difference in access from car or public transport journeys?
Thank you. So in 90 seconds.
6 questions. They will be yes and no answers, and I will need to read my own writing. Okay, good steer. Very difficult in terms of data quality and getting it out there. It's about human infrastructure as well as technical infrastructure, and being able to share something with caveats and say, these are the known unknowns of this data set, this is the context it was gathered in, this is the way it was gathered, that practical metadata, as it were, but also being able to talk about the limitations and confront those limitations is incredibly important. And in my opinion, I don't think we've quite got there yet, and we need to be better at that. In terms of known unknowns, there's basically no investment in this at the moment anyway, so I'd rather start with the things that we can start doing, and then those intractable unknown problems will emerge, hopefully, and then we can get there. I am rushing. Okay. Kent, it was pretty bad. But the use of geospatial data really, really helped. Understanding the value of the data, fascinating question, massive topic. We do have this approach of data equals value, data equals, oil and stuff, and insight and knowledge and, things that we, assume to be valuable, but what that value is very difficult. I don't have an answer for you right now, but my colleague Lawrence is working on a project with Diane Coyle and the Nuffield Foundation about the value of data to try and create a taxonomy about how we start describing that. So get in touch with him if you'd like to know about that a little bit more. I am out of time, so I am going to answer this last one. In terms of access to services, it was mapping the services in a geospatial way, which enabled the local council to start understanding that and start linking together different types of public services, because again, there was a lot of siloing happening. I hope those very rushed answers were vaguely useful. Thank you very much.